in the in his writing that's in the book.
First of all, 1 second, Larry. Good morning, everybody. Sorry we're a few minutes behind. We've been chatting here, but now we're back with our study session. We're going to be talking about Judith Pascal, but we're going to go back and talk about a little bit about Richard Levy first. So Larry had some questions.
Yeah, last week we started with Richard Levy, and you talked a little bit about the fact that what drove him into prominence, I guess, was that picture in was a Time magazine where he's wearing a yarmulke, and
it was Reform Judaism, funny enough. So it was the major
Reform
publication
Judaism
for us at the time, but that was probably the most controversial cover they've ever had, funny enough.
Yeah, and then I guess when we talked about him last week, and you brought up the principles from the Pittsburgh conference, if I recall, we said, for its time, it didn't. For our time now, those principles didn't seem very, very alarming. But now, when I read what he's written in the essay that's in the book that we've been using, I just want to go back for a few minutes to his views on the documentary hypothesis,
okay,
versus whether or not it is the word of God. The Torah is the word of God, and he seems to hang his hat a lot on that this really is, which is a very orthodox kind of view, and even he admits it's a very orthodox kind of view, that the Torah is really a divine document, and he gets into this slippery slope argument that if it is this documentary hypothesis where there's a J and an E and so forth, and people have edited it, that we're really paying attention to the editors more than we are to what's really in the Torah itself. And that if they edited it, then why can't I edit it? And I'll leave out certain things that I don't like, out of the Torah, and which gets us into the Judith Pascal as well, and it gets into even American history these days, where people don't want to recognize certain things in our history that have been reprehensible, in the past. And to me, that's kind of radical, because I had kind of believed that most of Reform Judaism believed in the documentary hypothesis, and but he's basically saying that's a very slippery slope, and we should not be on it. Am I correct there?
Yeah, I think a little. I think he definitely was supportive of it in certain respects. I think he would probably lean very strongly towards the idea that God influenced the people if it was done that way. Very strongly, even that God did it God's self. So he is definitely more towards that theology that God is involved. Now, whether God was involved in the editing with the people, that is a little vague, but I think he was definitely a supporter of it. But he was the champion of, this is not a human book. This is a God-driven book, whether it was written down by human beings, God was the writer. So an idea that God can use human beings to write these things down, but I think he's very God-centric in it. But yeah, I think he also does it because his belief was that we had kind of lost the connection with God. We'd become too practical, looking at the Bible and Talmud from a not secular perspective, but more of a cultural or a perspective, or as a law-binding perspective, as opposed to this is the way we connect with God. And so he really came out very strongly saying we can't forget. Basically, God wrote it, or it was written through God's divine hand, somebody else stroking the pen, so to say. But he was not overtly against it, as in saying, I don't believe it at all. And if that came out in here, then I think that was probably just the way it was written, or maybe with that in context. But he was not an anti-documentary hypothesis at all, but he was much more of a, let's put God into the equation. And he really felt like without God, then we are losing our identity, that the connection to God is really the essential part of all of this. But sometimes, and so we shouldn't lose sight for instance, the writing of the Talmud. We look at it from a certain perspective, a modern perspective, which is okay, that's our right. But he wants to remind us that the people who wrote it looked at it from this perspective that he's talking about. When they're writing the Talmud, they are looking at it as the perspective of God is, guiding them. And when we look at it, we kind of remember that's how they thought about it as they were writing it. Whereas sometimes we get into the minutia of the arguments they had and the individual idiosyncrasies. He wants us to say, wait a minute, let's look at how this was godly inspired and how it connects us to God. How when they wrote the Midrash, they're trying to fill in the gaps in ways that connect us to God as opposed to just creating, really interesting stories. But I think you're right.
On the other hand, where he also sort of, in the essay, he kind of criticizes us for not reading the Torah too carefully enough.
Yeah.
And stating that there are, so in other words, he on the one hand, he's saying the editors of the Torah, those who created the Mishnahs, the Midrashes, and so forth, they give us their interpretation, and they pick and choose, as you do, as everybody does for their sermons, and people do, they pick and choose, and sometimes you omit the bad parts. And what he's saying, though, is that he wants us, because he says there's even lessons in the bad parts.
Right.
And he uses the Noah's Ark as an example of, which to me is going back to the argument that you hear a lot from, there is no real argument for the Holocaust, but people say, well, the Holocaust was because God was, angry at us because we were bad, and, Noah's Ark, we were bad, and so forth. And he uses that as the argument, which is, I find, very difficult to.
Yeah, I think taking the Holocaust is a little bit farther than he would have taken it by far.
But even Noah's Ark is the one he uses.
Yeah, but you have to remember he kind of felt, understandably, that I don't think the word is whitewashing, more maybe ignoring some of the more difficult aspects of our Bible and later writings, things like the prophets and the priestly cult and some of the harsh punishments for seemingly minor offenses that come from time to time. And his perspective is this is all from God. We should not be ignoring all of these things and only concentrating on God of love. And you see this a little bit in Plaskow as well, though she's talking more from a feministic perspective. But that's all the Bible, and it's all ours, and it's all part of our religion. And there's nothing that should not be discussed. Everything should be, in the game. So
he talks about the embarrassing parts of the Torah.
Yeah, embarrassing is a good part. Is a good word he used.
Yeah.
And it's true, because when you come to services and you're reading a harsh section from the prophets or a very difficult section from the Bible from the Torah, you kind of feel uneasy, especially if they're non-Jews there or people who are visiting, and it's a harsher tone. But again, that's how they wrote. And so he would be very quick to say, let's not ignore these parts. Now, again, today, that's still a little controversial, because we still do that. The part about God, I think we're turning the corner a little bit and going that direction a little bit more. I think he's had a major impact. I mean, it's a lot easier to look at an impact 20 years later. And I think he's had a very big impact on the Reformed Jewish world, much more than he probably anticipated. I mean, remember, he is not the former head of the CCA, the former head of the URJ or the president of the college. He wasn't a rabbi at a prestigious university. He was not the rabbi of a giant mega synagogue. He was a Hillel rabbi, and yes, he was the head of the LA Hillel system. And then it just shows that this man who went in a very specific direction for his career really had something to say. And he came out and said it and worked his way through to be the head of the CCAR, which is not easy to become. That's only a 2-year gig. And so became dean of the rabbinical school, which is a really important position, but it's not the president of the rabbinical school, which is the real, illustrious one. And yet he's done a lot to show, to change the course or divert the course of Reform Judaism. I think it was already going in that way a bit, and he was one of those people who helped put the stamp on it. But yeah, he was, despite being not very tall, he was a giant. So for me, it's very unique because, as I said before, he's the only one of any of these people. I haven't talked about Dave Ellenson, but who I knew at all. I mean, Martin Buber just would never return my phone call.
Can I have one more question?
Sure, please.
Judith, on page 218.
Of Judith Pascal, 218?
Oh, this is the...
still Richard Levy, okay.
On page 218, they talk about, as liberal Jews, we know that not only the Halathic text, but also the Egotic ones as well, we should learn more. What's the difference between the Halathic and the Egotic?
Yeah, and that's an important distinction. The Halathic is the law binding, the Egotic is the stories. So the Halathic is considered the meat and potatoes of the law, and the Egotic is the stories that give us, images and teach us lessons. So they're both important, but obviously the Halathic, in terms of the law, those who are centered on the law are much more important, and the Egotic are less so. But he's trying to say that it's all part of our religion, although we should stop concentrating so much on the Egotic, because the Reform movement has sometimes gone the opposite route and looked at the stories more than the actual law themselves.
Yeah, and that's, to me, this is, it's very difficult for me, because you have a belief in God, and we say Torah is something that we should be following. And yet as Reformed Jews, we also say, well, each person is a republic unto him or herself. And to me, there's a real, I don't know if the word paradox or contradiction lies. And, and there are so many things in Torah that I don't think we would pay much attention to. I mean, but everyday things. I mean, the mixing wool and non-wool. I forget the Hebrew word for it, but I mean, I don't know. Do non-Orthodox people follow that?
Well, I think, excuse me, you would be right on what he was thinking. I mean, that's out of the word mouth, the idea that there's been a push to individualize Judaism in some respects in Reform movement. We are a community, but you kind of find what works for you and you take hold of that, and not counting the ethics. The ethics are always essential, right. But beyond the ethics, you kind of pick and choose. And what he's saying is, that's not how we work. I mean, we're a community. Certainly there are levels of choice available, but we can't concentrate on being the individual in the world. It's the community together. And so we really should be concentrating on the laws. He was, obviously kept strict kosher. I still remember. And I realized this like 2 years later or 5 years later. So I'm in the lunchroom, which is like just a room. And I'm eating sushi, but it's crab, but it's fake crab. It's kosher. And he sees me eating this, and I could tell he was so disappointed. I had no idea why. And like 5 years later, it came to me. It's like, oh, wait a minute. He may have thought it was real crab, because I brought it into the building. There were no rules that you couldn't do that. It was just understood. But yet this guy brought in crab into the lunchroom and was eating it in front of everybody. And I don't know, 5 years later, it just hit me that may have been why he was upset, or he gave me that look. But I never got to call him and tell him that it was just fake crab. So,
he may have even been disappointed, even if you said it was fake crab, because I've heard rabbis speak about this, and just even the appearance of something that gives the illusion that you're kind of like on the edge here, and maybe you can't tell between real and fake. And, but just the fact that, a lot of times we've gone to bar mitzvahs and things like this, and they take the fake crab and they put it into the shape of a shrimp. And it looks pretty good. It looks just like a shrimp, but it's the fake crab, and it tastes a little different than a shrimp. But, a lot of kosher places, I don't think would even, ultra galat kosher maybe, would not even
No.
do it.
Well, but that's the whole, and that's what one of the things that drives me crazy. If you are Orthodox or just observe kashrut, you might in your house, when you're dining with your family, you might put margarine on a baked potato. But if you have guests, maturnish,
Yeah, I think the appearance is important. You're right. I think he would be very much like that. But you got to remember, I was also in rabbinical school at a time when the rabbis were becoming more, not strict, but certainly following the laws a little bit more strictly. So most of the rabbinical students were keeping some semblance of kosher. Some were wearing yarmulkes all the time. Others were shomer Shabbos as much as possible. Not all, but certainly a lot of them, especially when you're in Israel, and it's so easy to do all these things.
Yeah.
So it's, I haven't been in the rabbinical school in a while, so I don't know what they're doing now, but at some point, it goes one way, and at some point it'll switch and go the other direction. The Reform movements has been going more the traditional routes for a while now. So at some point, obviously, it's going to switch the other way, and that's just how the world works.
He does say something that I did find really controversial in the fact that he is, a more believer in the divine Torah rather than the cultural Torah. And he says in the bottom of page 217 of our book, he says, the reader may have noticed that I said Torah asks us to continue the process and not Torah or God commands us. So in other words, what he's saying is that, he's kind of looking to, I guess, soften the idea that Torah doesn't give us the commandment, but Torah gives us this idea of continuing to learn and to understand, which I think is a more acceptable, meaning for me at any rate, rather than the command, like Michael says, between, linen and silk or
right,
whatever mixed cloths you're not supposed to wear. And I'm sure there was a reason behind it at the time, but nonetheless, it doesn't kind of make sense to us. Maybe at the time it did. And he talks about, some of the, the people who wrote the documentary hypothesis that they were time-centered, it was in their time, which
right.
we all know, things are, at the time, certain good people were in favor of slavery even and things like that. But it just seems like he's trying to have it both ways, by saying that, it's not a commandment, it's a process.
Yeah,
he's from him as well, that you didn't have to.
You have to remember, because he became so well known for being a radical, but he wasn't really a radical. He's not this, stand up and, stomping Bible person. So he was a very laid back and very open to everybody's opinion and very supportive. And he did not push his own opinions at all, even in his classes. In fact, you probably knew more about him being this radical from outside than you did inside, because inside he was a very, nurturing and supportive person who didn't try and push his, he gave his ideas, but didn't push his certain brand of theology. But you also have to remember, and this is generally the case, when you go to seminary, the seminary students are generally a little different than the congregants they're going to serve. They're usually a little bit more traditional in some cases, or in other places, a little bit more liberal. So they're usually swinging a little bit left or right of the population. And when I was in rabbinical school, we were getting a little bit more traditional. And so swinging towards Richard Levy's direction even before he got there. And so, the school was going in the direction he probably wanted in terms of theology, what they were teaching, how they were trying to connect it. Whereas the movement is moving a little slower that direction, but still moving that direction.
What's
So
your feeling today? This is like 25 years after, let's say, the Pittsburgh Conference. Have we moved more towards his feeling or more toward liberalization? Or
we've definitely moved. I mean, he's the direction we've gone overall in the reform movement. Obviously, our synagogue here in Savannah is a little bit, different. We're a little bit more classical in nature as well. But the question is, have we gone as far as we are going to go? And I think that may be the case. I think personally, we've gone as traditional as we're going to be able to go. And I expect in the next 30 or 40 years, we will start moving back the other way a little bit. I just think, there's a line where you go from Reform to Conservative Orthodox, and I don't think we're going to go there. And so I think, and again, this is not a new discussion. I mean, we had this in the 1880s and 70s with Isaac Mara Wise versus David Einhorn. And so we obviously don't have the two prominent people on either side, starting the movement. But yeah, I think we've been going pretty traditional for a long time. You see more people wearing yarmulkes. Hebrew's more important. You see people wearing taluses. You see a lot of writing about engaging the text. But, I think if you go on to fill in, for instance, is the border. I mean, in many cases, like you don't see Reform Jews doing to fill in that often, mostly because we meet on Saturday and you don't do to fill in on Saturday. You don't see Reform synagogues having daily minions in most cases. Now, some of the bigger ones do. My last synagogue did. I think they had, for various reasons, maybe a little here and there, but you don't see very strict kosher policies, but you do see kosher policies. Like most Reform synagogues have some sort of kosher policy, but it's not super strict, and they're not going to kick anybody out for doing something they shouldn't be doing, So, they accidentally brought pepperoni pizzas to a party. We ordered cheese pizzas. So everybody there wanted to eat them, except for the rabbi who said, no, we're going to donate them somewhere else. But that's pork. Mixing milk and meats is not as strict. So I think we're going as far as we can, and I expect we'll start moving the other way at some point. But we'll see.
Yeah, we got to talk about Judith Plaskow.
Yeah, we can talk about Judith Plaskow.
We need to, three white guys. We need to talk about some feminism here.
Well, Judith Plaskow is, one of probably the three most well-known, respected, and famous female liturgists or female theologians, I guess, or from the feminist perspective. The other two would be Marcia Falk and Rachel Adler. And actually, Rachel Adler was one of my professors as well. I never studied with Judith Plaskow, I think I thought. But very important for us to realize how big a game changer this is. Now, to us today, the basic step of gender neutral God references is assumed, like it's, we all understand it. We see it all the time. It was not the case 40 or 50 years ago. It wasn't even a thought in the major discussions, probably till the 60s and 70s, that all of the references to God, of course, obviously Hebrew is a gender-based language, which makes it a lot easier to keep the male-centeredness. So you have people like Judith Plaskow who had to actually start outside the Jewish world to be able to do this kind of stuff. And so, that's what she did. She went basically to Christian, not seminaries, but that's where she did her work for a long time. So the idea of this egalitarian language faced an uphill battle in several respects. One, it was so assumed that there wasn't even a second thought. The Lord is our God. I mean, Nobody thought a second thought about using the Lord, or the repression that had come from men and from the quieting of this female voice for so long. It was just assumed. And so then you have these women and some men coming forward and saying, this is so much a part of our lives, we don't realize what it is. And we have to really look from the outside and say, this language is part of a bigger issue, and that is the male-centeredness of religion. And so in Judaism, it's a lot harder because, again, Hebrew is a gender-based language. So you can't say anything without it having some sort of gender connection. So if it's not a male word, it's going to be a female word. So, and so taking also some of there's always been a few female references to God, and taking them and then also showing that we're not even using those correctly. So she and a lot of others had an uphill battle, mostly because it's like a fight that no one knew was there. I mean, it's like for most people, it's 1 + 1 is 3. I mean, I never thought about it. Why? I mean, 1 + 1 is 2. I mean, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Very simple things that you never thought about. To this day, we still all love the 23rd Psalm in the Old English. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So what we're going to look at is a couple of interesting ideas. Funny enough, the first part of this, they kind of have it in the reverse order of what they should. Yes, Larry.
Just a quick question. Gender-based language. The word, and I'm used to Romance languages as being gender-based. The word, let's say, like Elohim or Yehuda, are those inherently masculine words?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Is there a feminine word for God?
Yeah, I mean, Shekhinah is the most famous one. There are several of them. But again, what's really interesting is, and again, it's so funny because I guess I'm sure they had reason. They went backwards. They started off on the, 30, what's it called? What was the class? Instead of 101, they started on 301, and then they went to 101 in this particular one. So, but we'll kind of do that as well then. So what you have to understand also, it's not about changing the language only, it's about the meanings behind it. And they bring a really good points, probably the very beginning, about the language itself and how we use feminist theology. So the biggest issue she has at the beginning is what we would think is, we're doing it right. And she says, no, we're doing it wrong. And that is, well, let's bring the nurturing God, the feminist idea of God as a nurturer, God as a mother, God as a caring, loving presence. And so we might say, that's a great way of bringing feminist theology into the plate. And then Judith Plaskow is saying, wait a minute here. If you do that, you're being almost as bad as you were before, because then you're limiting feminist theology to this caring God. So you're basically saying God, caringness is the only part that is feminist. What about all the hard stuff? What about the difficult issues? That is still in the male form. It's almost of saying, well, we'll talk about Judaism from a feminist perspective for this nice stuff about God love, but the serious, difficult stuff, the controversial stuff, the stuff that's really interesting for many people, we're going to keep it in the male-based language. And so this first part is about her saying we got to be very careful about just using God as the source or wellspring or as all these things and putting them in a feministic characteristics, or that because we're then categorizing the feminine ideas. She wants to bring feminist theology to every aspect of Judaism, not just the, hey, this is the good stuff. This is the happy stuff. Because as we know, a lot of the meat and bones of Judaism is the discussion about the difficult things, because that's part of the religion. It's like we accept the fact that God is very complicated and from our sensibilities, not always really nice. And she says that has to be part of the feminist theology as well, or else we're really just doing the same thing we've been doing all over the place. So that's a really interesting part, because that's how she starts off with. I mean, at least the editors here, then they go into the other parts about the thing. So she makes a very clear case of the stories of Uzzah, Nadav, and Abihu, which are, of course, people killed by God for seemingly no reason at all. Nadav and Abihu did some sort of strange fire and they're killed. We don't know why. Uzzah, of course, is killed because they're moving, they're transporting the ark, I think, to Jerusalem, and it falls out and he catches it so it doesn't break. And he's killed for touching the ark because he is not a Cohen. So that is a very difficult story. You have somebody who is doing the right thing and is killed by God. So she says we have to bring the idea of the feminine side of God into these questions. Why is life so complicated and not just the easy stuff, I think is maybe how I would say it. And so that is how they start off with, which again is 3.0, because we haven't even got to the part about starting the process. So she has a really great line. I do not know how monotheists can choose to find God in dry land and not in the tidal wave that destroys it.
Yeah, that was great.
So, and there was a lot of them here, obviously, but that's, I think, a really good way of describing her view on feminist theology. They started off, and then they got to the point of saying, wait a minute, we need to go farther than we've gone before. Now, any questions or thoughts before we go on and go backwards to 101?
Yeah, that was the part. I read that part, about Uzzah and Nadav. It just seemed really troubling because she talks, to me, that's a divine injustice, right? But she labels it divine unpredictability.
Yeah, which I like better.
Yeah, but I mean, it just doesn't seem like, if you can't predict that God is always going to be just. I mean, if it's a divine unpredictability, you're saying God can be unpredictable. He could be good, he could be bad.
Yeah, but that's from, again, our sensibilities of justice and good and bad are human experiences that we base it on. I see a car about to hit somebody. I push the person out of the way, save the person, but what happens to me? I get killed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that is a attempt at a good thing, obviously, but something bad happens to me. So it's, to us, we may say it doesn't seem just, but we have our sensibilities. So what does that mean just to us and to different generations? So the ambiguity is probably a better way of describing it, because we don't have the whole context of what went on, first of all. And we all know that things happen which we don't think are fair. And if we ignore these things, then we're skipping over the most important parts. It's really easy to have a theology based on love when everything is easy, but that breaks down very quickly when you have.
I thought, I'm sorry.
Oh no, please, Michael.
No, I thought I found this rather difficult, actually. But one of the things that I picked up, and maybe erroneously, is that she talks about God as a creator, and that God. Let me see my note here. Okay, yeah, that God creates, and and she talks about that. But then, left unsaid, I thought, is that if God can create, can God destroy? And I don't think she ever addresses that aspect.
Well, she's, destroy is, again,
Maybe
is that meant to be purposeful, or is that meant to be things happen? So you're right. She doesn't get into that. she talks a lot about creating because the point she wants to make is that we are co-creators with God, that we have a part to play in this, and that she thinks that should be part of the feminist theology, that we have this, she uses the Pasichta Rabbati that says, face after face instead of face to face. God appeared to the children of Israel. God spoke to the Israelites on Mount Sinai, not face to face, but face after face, which means she takes it as God is speaking individually to each person as God is speaking to everyone at the same time. And so also we can see different faces of God. Some will see it as angry, so it's again going to the idea that we all have our individual relationships with God, but that also there are wider ones. But you're right, when it comes to does God destroy, she didn't get into that here. She does get into the idea that the world is complicated. But
I would have liked if she probably would have just stopped at saying, things are unpredictable, and rather than try and justify why they're unpredictable, and that they should be included, even though they're unpredictable, and that we may not understand them. And maybe one of the understandings is in, let's say, what Kushner has said and others have said, is that, laws are set in motion and rocks don't obey those laws all the time, and nature's got kind of its own laws, of the spiritual thing. I think I would have gone for that, but I just don't like the idea where she says, divine justice, but then it's unpredictable.
Right now, you're using the word justice. Ways.
That was my problem with it. But
yeah, it's interesting that we, if you think about it, as we've gone through all these philosophers, we've never, and I did it, and you just did it, Larry. We've never, I think, expressed questions in a critical way, but we did now in feminist writing, and I think that's kind of accidental, but I also think that it's because in part what she's doing represents a way of thinking that is really different. And I think it's gender-based that it's different, that we as men may not fully, as older men, may not fully appreciate. And I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's changing.
Go ahead.
Larry?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, even when she talks about language, and I don't know Hebrew that well, but prayer Hebrew I know reasonably well. And, how are you changing language if we constantly say Melech, she doesn't say, why can't you say Malka?
Right.
A simple change, but she doesn't. And she really kind of skirts around the whole question of how you change language. And you talked about that, started.
Well, and I think that's a lot that Marcia Falk is really the one who does that more. She is a little bit more of the liturgist who tries to go in and change the language itself, which is very hard because we're so used to saying Baruch Atah Eloheinu Melech Haolam, which every one of those is a blessed are you, masculine ruler of the masculine, king masculine, world masculine. So this is one of the things. What she also don't know. We got a few more minutes, but she also wants to make sure. She goes into a kind of a tangent here about anthropomorphizing God. She is very supportive of it. Yeah. So a lot of people think that she said, it's the only thing we have to use is language, so we can give God traits that we read, that we have as humans, but that we have to be careful about how we do it and to make sure use the imagery in a way that is supportive of feminist theology as well, even as we use these general things like the source or of the world. So
That's kind of like what I got out of it, is that maybe she felt the pendulum is swinging too far toward the feminist movement, in trying to put in all of the kindness and the goodness that is there, and that we're emphasizing that and ignoring some of the realities of life. Almost the way that Levy was saying it, you can't just pick and choose the parts of the Bible or the Torah that you want. And she's saying that maybe we've got to move back. And I think her compromise at the end, if I read it, is that, yeah, maybe it is a combination of both. Now, Christianity kind of takes the other approach, does it? I mean, it's been a while since I've read the Gospels and things like that. But in general, in those Gospels, they kind of emphasize, there's not much about war, and there's not much about, plagues and those kind. I mean, the people that have plagues are healed, basically. They don't suffer, they don't die, they're not, the lepers are healed, and they're brought back to life. And
I saw Ben-Hur, I remember.
All these wonderful things, yeah, Ben-Hur. So it seems like, maybe she's saying the pendulum has swung too far, and let's bring it back, and we can recognize that there are some good qualities and some bad qualities, but we should have them both. Kind of like I said before, it's this debate we're having right now. I wouldn't say it's even a debate, but it's, people who want to, forget about, what American history was, maybe what the Declaration of Independence said compared to what, slavery did and stuff like that.
Yeah, and these are all the difficult questions that I think feminist theology wants to be part of. How is complicated? God is the other, God is something beyond, but we still are making references to God. So we have to be very careful to bring in all aspects of God and use all those aspects from a feminine and masculine perspective. But the feminine and masculine perspectives should not be the ones that are stereotyped, which is interesting because as we talked about when we did the Kabbalah, you talked about the Sfirot, the bridge to God, and they have the feminine and masculine characteristics.
Right.
What we think of masculine are actually the feminine. So the caring, the connectiveness, that's the masculine. The discipline, the order, that's the feminine. Kind of like what you traditionally see in a household, stereotypically, where the mother is raising the kids, but is also the strict one. That, of course, is not the case in my household, because obviously I'm the strict one.
Yeah.
I'm the authoritarian in our household, taking charge.
I'm glad you gave that analogy back to the Kabbalists, because I was going to say that her use of imagery, or her belief in putting, some images, makes it even more difficult, because we tend to, because of society, because of the way we were raised, and we tend to look at these images more as masculine than feminine. And the Kabbalists maybe have it right if you look at the traits, the masculine traits that are really feminine, and vice versa. But she doesn't talk about that. But that may be.
She does it other times, but this is a limited. Okay. But I think if we summarize, and I apologize, I'm going to finish right at 11:30 because I got to make this call about this funeral preparations. But she would say feminist theology is essential. We have to find ways to bring the feminine qualities into our world. However, feminist theology should not just be about nurturing and love and support and being the mother. Feminist theology encompasses all aspects of God, from the very difficult issues like Nadav, Abihu, to the very controversial ones where God does something that we just consider very unjust. Nadav and Abihu we consider unjust, but it's really kind of vague because we don't know exactly what they do. But Uzzah, we know a little bit. He saves the ark. I mean, that's much more complicated when we see he has the best of intentions, and it's very obvious he does. Nadav and Abihu, it's a little hard to know exactly what's going on there. So that's what she wants to do. And I think what we're seeing is every generation, especially in America, is getting a little bit better. like the generations below after me, men, I think, are getting a little bit more understanding in certain circles of women's beliefs, how to be caring fathers, how to bring, equality for women is not there, but it's certainly better than it was 80 or 90 years ago. So it's something that we're getting better at. We haven't quite got there, but the next generations, are always hope. So hopefully we're going in the right way. So next week, hi, Jane.
Jane had a Hadassah meeting, so unfortunately they scheduled their meetings on Wednesdays at the same time.
Just one Wednesday.
One Wednesday a month.
We need to get rid of that. Let's stop doing it. Hadassah is always getting in the way.
Such a feminist organization.
Yes, I know. I cannot support them at all. Of course, my wife is the president of our Hadassah chapter, so I better not say that, but it's recorded. Oh, it's too late. It's on YouTube forever. And in fact, I've got the kids tomorrow night because she has. No, that's something else now. So again, next week, we are going to be at Wendy Elevik's. So please let her know what you can bring. She's going to make the latkes. Be nice to have latkes 2 weeks after Hanukkah. Kind of cool. And we'll probably do a little lesson online, and then we're not going to do a gift exchange at all. But if you are going to buy your rabbi a gift, I do need a new car. I'm just putting that out there. So
a Tesla? Are you thinking a Tesla?
A Tesla would be fine. I mean, you don't have to go to that length, but that would be, I think that would be preferable. And maybe some Tesla stock.
I'll send out an email to the congregation.
Well, yeah. The list. Yeah, if I have 10 cars, I'm happy with that too. Just put me in a garage to put it in. Well, you guys stay safe. Happy post Hanukkah. Always a pleasure. So we'll do Hanukkah. I sent out the schedule. We have next week the Hanukkah party, and then we will not have class the 2 weeks after because I'm not sure what my schedule is going to be, if I'm going to take time off or not.
All right. And you did say you think you were going to go to the service tomorrow at the.
I'm
okay. Good. We'll see you there.
I'm officiating tomorrow, so I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Oh, you are. Okay. Okay.
All my mess, everybody. Stay safe.